Little Town on the Prairie opens with a question from Pa. How would you like to work in town, Laura? This simple question signals a major shift in the fictional Ingalls family's life and in Laura's maturity. Never before had life in town appealed to the Ingalls family, other than offering a place to worship or to educate the girls, or as a refuge from the hard winter, as we saw in the previous book. But even then, Laura accepted the concept of town reluctantly. Laura did not sleep very well. All night it seemed she knew that the town was close around her and that she must go to school in the morning. She was heavy with dread. And yet suddenly, the archetypal pioneer patriarch, Charles Ingalls, looks toward town as a place of opportunity for the daughter who, like himself, has always had an affinity for the wild, untamed spaces of the West. This is a major shift, and it signals an important transition within Wilder's larger scheme for the Little House books. The family is well on its way to becoming settled. They have established their home in the West and now must find their place within a newly formed and settled community. For Laura herself, this shift also signals something more, a new maturity, an acceptance of new responsibilities, and even a certain amount of independence, a life away from the relative isolation and protection of her family. Not surprisingly, at the end of the first chapter, Laura thought of the town and of the homestead claim where they were all so busy and happy now in the springtime, and she did not want anything changed. She did not want to work in town. So, instant conflict. Laura doesn't want these changes. She's reluctant to leave her childhood behind. This is an unusual opening for Wilder, not just because the book begins with instant conflict, but because the next chapters in Little Town on the Prairie, chapters 2 through 4, are essentially flashback, illustrating Laura's contentment with life on the homestead claim. Wilder's previous Little House books contained very little exposition or background information for readers. Remember how quickly Wilder moved through the major transitions the fictional family had faced during the opening pages of By the Shores of Silver Lake. Mary's illness and blindness, the family's subsequent financial crisis, the birth of baby Grace. Wilder relays all of this in the first 2 pages of the books. And on page 3, she then tells readers that 2 years have transpired. In other words, Wilder conveys 2 years in 2.5 pages. But in Little Town on the Prairie, after Pa asks in the first line, "How would you like to work in town, Laura?" Wilder takes 34 pages to deliver Laura's answer to Pa's question. Yes, 34 pages. Why so much flashback? Why does Wilder essentially stop the forward action of the novel to linger on a short slice of Laura's life, the spring and early summer after the hard winter? Although Little Town on the Prairie is Wilder's 3rd young adult novel, the action in this book will eventually revolve around major transformations in Laura's character. As Wilder writes in the book's 2nd chapter, Laura is too old to follow Pa as he plows the prairie sod, playing as Carrie and Grace do, because Laura was going on 15 years old now, too old to play in the fresh, clean-smelling dirt. Wilder uses the flashback chapters in the opening of the book to illustrate Laura's internal conflict, the pull of childhood against new responsibilities, the conflict between a simple country life and the complex and varied world of life in town. Wilder illustrates Laura's commitment with country living in the flashback chapters, and in such passages as these. Laura wanted nothing more than being outdoors. She felt she could never get enough sunshine soaked into her bones. living in the country and feeling such contentment, perhaps for the first time in her life. Laura has time for introspection and revelation, which of course will ultimately lead to transformation, though Laura doesn't know it yet. In a pivotal scene with Mary in the book's second chapter, Laura launches into a struggle that will carry her through the rest of the book. Her quest to understand goodness and embrace it. Mary had always been good. Sometimes she'd been so good that Laura could hardly bear it. But now she seemed different. Once Laura asked her about it. "You used to try to be good all the time," Laura said, "and you always were good. It made me so mad sometimes I wanted to slap you. But now you are good without even trying." Mary stopped still. "Oh, Laura, how awful. Do you ever want to slap me now?" "No, never," Laura answered honestly. "You honestly don't? You aren't just being gentle to me because I'm blind?" "No, really and honestly. No, Mary. I hardly think about your being blind. I'm glad you're my sister. I wish I could be like you. But I guess I never can be," Laura sighed. "I don't know how you can be so good." And by extension, Laura herself doesn't know how to be good. Later in this conversation with Mary, Laura says, "But my goodness, how could anybody be good without thinking about it?" This struggle sets the stage for Laura's very adult decision later in the novel to set aside her own desires and teach school to help pay Mary's college tuition. But in the meantime, these first 34 flashback pages in Little Town on the Prairie underscore a brief moment in Laura's adolescent life when she is happy, contented, and reluctant to face the inevitable changes ahead. Like the West itself, Laura is caught up in a transient moment before civilization catches up to them both. Life on the open prairie is filled with sweetness and hope, suspended in a kind of timelessness and independence. Beyond the open door and window, the prairie was dusky, but the sky was pale, with the first stars beginning to quiver in it. In all that satisfaction, perhaps the best part was knowing that tomorrow would be like today, the same and yet a little different from all the other days, as this one had been. But Laura did not know this until Pa asked her, "How would you like to work in town?" And then on the following page, page 35, the novel really begins. Laura leaves her idyllic country life behind and begins a new and seemingly unwelcome adventure in town, an experience that will forever change and shape her. But before moving ahead, a few more observations about these flashback chapters at the beginning of the book. As I said earlier, they illustrate a new prosperity for the fictional family. Pa buys a plow, he plants corn, and begins to transform the claim shanty into a house with 3 rooms, each with its own window. Laura realizes that someday they would have all the good things to eat again, for better times were coming. Yet Laura also realizes that the West is a settled country now, hardly any game left, and this new settled world affects Pa as well as Laura. Throughout the series, he has served as her mentor and guide. The two of them have always shared an affinity for wild, untamed spaces. Now Pa, as well as Laura, must accept a shift, and for him, he must evolve from a groundbreaking pioneer to a leading citizen of a prosperous small town. In the flashback chapters, we see Pa's transition. He spends much of his time not on the homestead claim, but in town, working as a carpenter, laying the foundation for a new church. Every morning he did the chores and walked to town. He began working promptly at 7 o'clock and was through work at 6:30 and home again for a late supper. And every week he was earning $15. So it isn't surprising then that Pa, as Laura's mentor, leads her into her new life in town. He offers her the prospect of change and transformation. And because during these flashback chapters, readers have seen Laura struggle with what it means to be good and have witnessed her deepening loyalty to Mary, Laura's decision to accept this new opportunity seems entirely credible. And like Pa, Laura thinks about this change, country life versus city living, in terms of dollars and cents, and what it would mean to Mary. After Pa explains the offer to Laura, she quickly multiplied in her head. That was $1.50 a week, a little more than $6 a month. If she worked hard and pleased Mrs. White, maybe she could work all summer. She might earn $15, maybe even $20, to help send Mary to college. In her heart, Laura doesn't want to give up her country life, but she sacrifices her own desires for Mary's good and for the family's. And yet, in making this sacrifice, Laura is also charting out a new independence from the fictional family. Throughout the rest of the novel and into the next book, Laura becomes her own person with experiences that are unique to herself.